From the UN Climate Summit in Madrid, Spain, this is Democracy Now!
In just 3 weeks, we will enter a new decade. A decade that will define our future. Right now, we are desperate for any sign of hope. Well, I'm telling you, there is hope. I have seen it. But it does not come from the governments or corporations. It comes from the people.
16-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg addresses world leaders here in Madrid just hours before being named Times Person of the Year. We'll hear her full UN address. Just hours after Greta's speech, hundreds of climate activists are ushered out of the conference center by police.
This is exactly what has been happening across the world. We have been shut out and we have not been heard. We the people, have been kept out while the very polluters who drive this crisis are kept in.
We'll hear voices from the protests and speak with Vanessa Nakate, the first Fridays for Future climate striker in Uganda. Then we look at ground zero of the climate crisis, the Marshall Islands.
We've been told that if we want to stay in our islands, we'd have to adapt and elevate, and with migration as the only plan B. We're having to deal with these issues that we in the first place
We will also speak to poet Kathy Jetnil Kijiner of the Marshall Islands. She is the daughter of the president of the Marshall Islands. All that and more coming up. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the UN Climate Summit in Madrid, Spain. The European Commission has proposed a sweeping new plan to address the climate crisis. The European Green Deal would be the biggest overhaul of European policy since the foundation of the modern European Union system. This is EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
We do not have all the answers yet. Today is the start of a journey. But this is Europe's man on the moon moment.
The European Green New Deal would seek to have Europe become the first climate-neutral continent by 2050. It would also seek to halve greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. European leaders are discussing the emissions goals at a summit in Brussels today. Environmentalists here at COP25 in Madrid, Spain, welcomed the plan, but said it doesn't go far enough in cutting greenhouse gas emissions. This is Greenpeace campaigner Martin Kaiser.
The new Green Deal proposed by the Commission today is not the adequate answer to the climate emergency we see already in Europe.
Back in the United States, Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee Wednesday, where he reiterated his report's key finding that the FBI's opening of an investigation into President Trump's 2016 campaign aides was not politically motivated. During the hearing, Republican lawmakers slammed the FBI over the myriad errors the report revealed about the FBI's process of seeking approval to surveil former Trump campaign advisor Carter Page. These applications were filed to the secret FISA court created by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Civil liberty experts have long warned of the court's unaccountable and secretive nature for approving domestic surveillance, especially against Muslims. This is Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz.
We found, and as we outline here, are deeply concerned that so many basic and fundamental errors were made by 3 separate hand-picked investigative teams on one of the most sensitive FBI investigations after the matter had been briefed to the highest levels within the FBI, even though the information sought through the use of FISA authority related so closely to an ongoing presidential campaign, and even though those involved with the investigation knew that their actions would likely be subjected to close scrutiny.
Inspector General Michael Horowitz also pushed back on Attorney General William Barr's statement Monday, claiming the FBI should not have opened the 2016 investigation in the first place. In West Africa, over 70 troops were killed in an attack on a military camp in Niger near the border with Mali. It's the deadliest attack on Nigerian military in recent history. No one's taken responsibility for the attack so far, but Islamist militants have carried out a string of attacks across the Sahel region in West Africa so far this year. The attack came only days before a planned security summit in France between the presidents France, Niger, and 4 other West African leaders. The summit has now been postponed. France has at least 4,500 troops deployed to the Sahel region. In Algeria, mass demonstrations rocked the country Wednesday as protesters demanded the cancellation of today's national election to replace Algeria's longtime president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who was forced from power by a mass uprising in April.
I won't vote because these elections themselves are a betrayal. Everyone who votes is committing a betrayal against our country because the summit of stupidity is to try the same experience with the same people and tools and expect a different result.
Extremely low turnout at the polls is expected today amidst widespread calls to boycott the election, with demonstrators saying that all the candidates are part of Algeria's long-ruling elite. On Tuesday, 2 previous prime ministers were convicted and sentenced to prison over a corruption scandal that also ensnared other top government officials and businessmen. In Britain, voters are also heading to the polls today for a defining national election which pits Conservative Prime Minister Boris Johnson against Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn. At stake in the election is the future of Britain's public health system and how to handle Brexit, Britain's plan to leave the European Union. At The Hague, Burma's de facto leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, is attempting to defend the Burmese military from charges of genocide against Muslim Rohingyas at the UN International Court of Justice. The Burmese military killed and raped thousands of Rohingya and forced more than 700,000 to flee into neighboring Bangladesh in a brutal army crackdown in 2017. During Aung San Suu Kyi's speech at The Hague, she never said the word Rohingya, and she claimed no genocide had taken place.
Regrettably, the Gambia has placed before the court an incomplete and misleading factual picture of the situation in Rakhine State in Myanmar. Yet, it is of the utmost importance that the court assess the situation obtaining on the ground in Rakhine dispassionately and accurately.
Aung San Suu Kyi is a Nobel Peace Prize winner who was placed under house arrest for 15 years while campaigning against Burmese military rule. She's now defending that same military while it continues to hold vast power in Burma. This is Rohingya refugee Shamsul Alam speaking from Bangladesh after watching Aung San Suu Kyi's speech at The Hague.
Aung San Suu Kyi was in jail. She is afraid of that jail, so she is lying only to stay in power. She is lying to the ICJ court. We are crying so much pain. We call upon the UN and all nations, please help us get justice from this genocide.
In India, the upper house of parliament has passed the highly controversial Citizenship Amendment Bill, widely known as the Anti-Muslim Bill. Legislation provides a path to citizenship for immigrants from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan unless they're Muslim. The bill is part of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's right-wing Hindu nationalist agenda, and many say it's a major step toward the official marginalization of India's 200 million Muslims. The Indian Union Muslim League is petitioning India's Supreme Court to declare the bill unconstitutional. Widespread protests against the bill have swept across parts of India this week, especially in the northeast. The government has deployed the army to the northeastern state of Assam. This is Binoy Viswam, a leader of the Communist Party of India, speaking from New Delhi.
Not only our party, not only the left, the whole country will oppose it, because that's a legislation which runs against the basic content of the Constitution.
The Knesset has dissolved And the country is headed toward its third national election in a year after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and rival Benny Gantz both failed to form a governing coalition. The election will be held on March 2nd. The political chaos in Israel comes as Netanyahu is also facing charges in 3 criminal corruption cases. In France, workers are vowing to continue their strike after French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe gave a televised address outlining the proposed pension overhaul. Philippe claimed the legal retirement age would remain 62, although the proposed change would effectively raise the retirement age to 64 for all people born after 1974. Union leaders called the raising of the retirement age a red line, and many rail lines and schools remain shuttered today amidst mass protests across France. Police unions have also joined the strike, which now stretches into its second week. Here in Madrid, Spain, at COP25, the UN Climate Summit, hundreds of activists gathered Wednesday outside the conference's main plenary halls to demand rich countries take more drastic action to address the climate crisis. Activists report being pushed and forced out of the building. Security. More than 300 protesters were forced outside. A number had their credentials temporarily removed. We'll have a full report on the protests later in the broadcast. Disgraced Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein and the board of his now bankrupt company have reached a tentative $25 million settlement with dozens of women who've accused him of rape, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. The deal would not require Weinstein to admit any wrongdoing, nor would Weinstein have to pay any of his own money to the dozens of actresses and female employees who've accused him of serial rape and sexual harassment. Weinstein is also facing criminal sexual assault charges in New York and is scheduled to attend court in early January. The Federal Trade Commission's reached the largest ever settlement with a for-profit college, the University of Phoenix, over charges of deceptive advertising and marketing false job opportunities to students. The university's record $191 million settlement will include canceling $141 million in student debt. FTC member Rohit Chopra said, quote, "Today's action against the University of Phoenix and future actions against scam schools will set the stage for canceling more student debt," unquote. President Trump signed a highly controversial executive order Wednesday aimed at cracking down on the growing boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement known as BDS. The global nonviolent movement seeks to pressure Israeli government over its treatment of Palestinians. Trump's executive order will direct federal agencies to adopt a new definition of anti-Semitism to include criticisms of Israel, and then to penalize college campuses and universities that allow for conversations and debate about the Israeli government. Many prominent American Jewish groups oppose the executive order, even though it claims to protect Jews and rising anti-Semitism worldwide. The Jewish group J Street said the order is designed to have a, quote, chilling effect on free speech, unquote. Other Jewish groups that said Trump himself has fostered anti-Semitism and frequently repeated anti-Semitic tropes, and that this executive order is more about the administration's support for Israel than to protect American Jews. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, has again attempted to issue fines as large as $500,000 against immigrants who've taken sanctuary in churches across the country to resist their deportations. ICE sent warning letters to 7 immigrants, threatening them with fines and criminal prosecution. This comes after it tried to issue fines last summer but had to revoke them. David Benyon, an attorney at Free Migration Project working with some of the sanctuary leaders, said the fines are unconstitutional because they restrict freedom of speech and violate the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And in Jersey City, New Jersey, hundreds of people gathered Wednesday night to mourn victims of Tuesday's mass shooting, which authorities are calling a hate crime. Authorities say the shootout began when 2 suspects killed a police officer, then fled to a kosher supermarket where a gun battle with police unfolded. The alleged assailants were linked to the Black Hebrew Israelite movement, described as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. The shootout left 6 people dead and follows a pair of deadly attacks at U.S. synagogues within the past 14 months, including the 2018 attack at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh that claimed 11 lives. There, the alleged shooter cited President Trump's language when saying that this synagogue supported the Hispanic invaders. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from inside the United Nations Climate Change Conference here in Madrid, Spain, where 16-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg addressed the plenary on Wednesday. She spoke just a few hours before being named Time magazine's Person of the Year.
I didn't speak to anyone unless I really had to. But then I found a reason to speak. Since then, I've given many speeches and learned that when you talk in public, you should start with something personal or emotional to get everyone's attention. Say things like, "Our house is on fire, I want you to panic," or "How dare you?" But today I will not do that, because then those phrases are all that people focus on. They don't remember the facts, the very reason why I say those things in the first place. We no longer have time to leave out the science. For about a year, I have been constantly talking about our rapidly declining carbon budgets over and over again. But since that is still being ignored, I will just keep repeating it. In Chapter 2, on page 108 in the SR 1.5 IPCC report that came out last year, it says that if we are to have a 67% chance of limiting the global temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we had on January 1st, 2018, 420 gigatons of CO2 left to emit in that budget. And of course, that number is much lower today, as we emit about 42 gigatons of CO2 every year, including land use. With today's emissions levels, that remaining budget will be gone within about 8 years. These numbers aren't anyone's opinions or political views. This is the current best available science. Though many scientists suggest these figures are too moderate, these are the ones that have been accepted through the IPCC. And please note that these figures are global and therefore do not say anything about the aspect of equity, which is absolutely essential to make the Paris Agreement work on a global scale. That means that richer countries need to do their fair share and get down to real zero emissions much faster, and then help poorer countries do the same, so people in less fortunate parts of the world can raise their living standards. These numbers also don't include most feedback loops, non-linear tipping points, or additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution. Most models assume, however, that future generations will somehow be able to suck hundreds of billions of tons of CO2 out of the air with technologies that do not exist in the scale required and maybe never will. The approximate 67% chance budget is the one with the highest odds given by the IPCC. And now we have less than 340 gigatons of CO2 left to emit in that budget to share fairly. And why is it so important to stay below 1.5 degrees? Because even at 1 degree, people are dying from the climate crisis. Because that is what the United Science calls for, to avoid destabilizing the climate, so that we have the best possible chance to avoid setting off irreversible chain reactions, such as melting glaciers, polar ice, and thawing Arctic permafrost. every fraction of a degree matters. So there it is again. This is my message. This is what I want you to focus on. So please tell me, how do you react to these numbers without feeling at least some level of panic? How do you respond to the fact that basically nothing is being done about this without feeling the slightest bit of anger? And how do you communicate this without sounding alarmist? I would really like to know. Since the Paris Agreement, global banks have invested $1.9 trillion in fossil fuels. 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions. The G20 countries account for almost 80% of total emissions. The richest 10% of the world's population produce half of our CO2 emissions, while the poorest 50% account for just 1/10. We indeed have some work to do, but some more than others. Recently, a handful of rich countries pledged to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases by so and so many percent by this or that date, or to become climate neutral or net zero in so and so many years. This may sound impressive at first glance, but even though the intentions may be good, this is not leadership. This is not leading, this is misleading. Because most of these pledges do not include aviation, shipping, and imported and exported goods and consumption. They do, however, include the possibility of countries to offset their emissions elsewhere. These pledges don't include the immediate yearly reduction rates needed for wealthy countries, which is necessary to stay within the remaining tiny budget. 0 in 2050 means nothing if high emission continues even for a few years, then the remaining budget will be gone. Without seeing the full picture, we will not solve this crisis. Finding holistic solutions is what the COP should be all about. But instead, it seems to have turned into some kind of opportunity for countries to negotiate loopholes and to avoid raising their ambition. Countries are finding clever ways around having to take real action, like double counting emissions reductions and moving their emissions overseas, and walking back on their promises to increase ambition, or refusing to pay for solutions or loss and damage. This has to stop. What we need is real, drastic emission cuts at the source. But of course, just reducing emissions is not enough. Our greenhouse gas emissions has to stop. To stay below 1.5 degrees, we need to keep the carbon in the ground. Only setting up distant dates and saying things which give the impression of that action is underway will most likely do more harm than good, because the changes required are still nowhere in sight. The politics needed does not exist today, despite what you might hear from world leaders. And I still believe that the biggest danger is not inaction. The real danger is when politicians and CEOs are making it look like real action is happening when, in fact, almost nothing is being done apart from clever accounting and creative PR. I have been fortunate enough to be able to travel around the world. And my experience is that the lack of awareness is the same everywhere, not the least amongst those elected to lead us. There is no sense of urgency whatsoever. Our leaders are not behaving as if we were in an emergency. In an emergency, you change your behavior. If there's a child standing in the middle of the road and cars are coming at full speed, you don't look away because it's too uncomfortable. You immediately run out and rescue that child. And without that sense of urgency, how can we, the people, understand that we are facing a real crisis? And if the people are not fully aware of what is going on, then they will not put pressure on the people in power to act. And without pressure from the people, our leaders can get away with basically not doing anything, which is where we are now. And around it goes. In just 3 weeks, we will enter a new decade. A decade that will define our future. Right now, we are desperate for any sign of hope. Well, I'm telling you, there is hope. I have seen it. But it does not come from the governments or corporations. It comes from the people. The people who have been unaware but are now starting to wake up. And once we become aware, we change. People can change. People are ready for change. And that is the hope, because we have democracy. And democracy is happening all the time, not just on election day, but every second and every hour. It is public opinion that runs the free world. In fact, every great change throughout history has come from the people. We do not have to wait. We can start the change right now. We, the people. Thank you.
That's 16-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg. Right after her address, scores of youth activists rushed the stage as security tried to escort them off. They stood immovable, fists raised in the air, chanting, "You can't drink oil, keep it in the soil." Their final chant as they walked off the stage was, "We are unstoppable. Another world is possible."
We are unstoppable. Another world is possible. We are unstoppable. Another world is possible.
Outside the UN summit plenary on Thursday afternoon, we'll hear voices from the protests that took place that afternoon and speak with Uganda's first Fridays for Future climate striker. She was there on the stage in the morning, and she was pushed outside as she protested with others in the afternoon. We'll be speaking with future climate striker Vanessa Nakate. Stay with us.
Rise before the seas, we rise as tall as trees. We rise not just for you and me, but for all humanity. We rise before the seas. We rise as tall as trees. We rise not just for you and me, but for all humanity. We rise, rise for liberation. We rise, rise for liberation. We rise, rise for all creation.
We rise, rise for all creation.
We rise before the seas.
We rise before the seas.
We rise as tall as trees.
We rise as tall as trees.
We rise not just for you and me.
We rise not just for you and me,
but for all humanity.
But for all humanity.
We rise, rise for liberation.
We rise, rise for liberation.
We rise, rise
Orion Camero singing during the walkout protest here at the Climate Summit on Wednesday. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from inside the UN Climate Summit here in Madrid, Spain. Just hours after Greta Thunberg slammed world leaders for ignoring climate science at the plenary on Wednesday. And just as Time magazine announced she was their choice for Person of the Year, hundreds of activists gathered to demand rich countries take more drastic action to address the climate crisis. The protest began just as we were finishing our live broadcast. Right now, the protesters are walking by us, by Tom and Corrine. Security opened up what looks like a large garage door. They're holding the front person who's got his hand up in a fist, and now hundreds of people are passing us as they walk out of the COP. As they walk out of the COP, it's not clear why they're walking out of the COP. But what they're doing, Tom, why don't you explain?
There's a possibility that they're going to lose their badges.
Tom is afraid that they will lose their badges if they walk out of the COP.
My name is Rita Uwaka. I'm from Nigeria. I represent Friends of the Earth. We want sustainable solutions. We want people power solutions. We want solutions that connect the people to the ground. There are a lot of devastation in communities in different landscapes across the world. People are dying every day for sins they did not commit. And we are here to say, no more corruption with our COP. We want the people's voice to be heard. We want a climate just solution. We don't want carbon markets. We want people power solutions. And that's why we're calling our governments on COP to listen to the voice of the people. That is why we are here. We will not be coerced. We'd like to quickly call on another speaker. Her name is Angela.
We are here in solidarity with Chile. With Chile and all countries that are facing human rights violations. We are here in solidarity with the frontline communities. With the millions of people in the global south who are facing the worst of the climate crisis. We are here because we haven't forgotten about them, about our present and our future. We are here because we need our governments to listen to us. This last week, it's been all about profit, carbon markets, nature-based solutions that don't respond to the needs of people and nature. If we unite, we can have a present and a future grounded in justice.
No false solutions! No false solutions! No false solutions!
We have one last speaker. She's from the Amazon, and she's here to share one last thing with all of you here.
Mi nombre es Sandra Tucup.
My name is Sandra Tucup. I am from the Ecuadorian Amazon, and I am here because our territories are being violated. Those industries that are causing climate change are polluting our rivers and our territories. We are here because we're defending our territory. We're defending biodiversity. We're defending the planet. We're defending the rivers. Because you know that in each and every one of us, we have water. We are water. Because without the water, we cannot live. Without our territory, without our soil, we cannot live. Without the earth, we cannot live, no matter how much money we have. The earth is our mother, and we're here to tell the big industries to stop violating our territories, to stop destroying our lands.
Polluters out, let the people in.
Keep polluters out, let the people in.
Keep polluters out, let the people in.
Keep polluters out, let the people in.
This is what will happen.
This is what will happen.
They have decided that they don't want us there.
That they don't want us there.
They are debadging us.
They are debadging us.
How can
is Amalin Sadananda from Malaysia. I'm part of the activistnetwork.org.
So what happened to your badge?
They were not happy that I decided to help and join this movement, and they were not happy with what I had to say. They took my badge immediately and tried to throw me out.
Who opened the garage door?
The UNFCCC security. They were so afraid of us that they wanted to get rid of us as soon as possible. That's something completely ridiculous. We spend months and months and months trying to get accreditation, trying to plan out things that happen inside here, but they refuse to listen to us. They refuse to listen to our voice, and that is just blasphemy.
Why did you go outside?
We went outside because they forced us out.
Brandon Wu, Action Aid USA. We were actually kettled by UN security. They pushed us outside, out this door, and then they actually closed the door behind us, and there were people who didn't even intend to be part of this.
My name is Nina Sirengwalinga, and I'm from the Quichua people of Sarayaku in the Ecuadorian Amazon. We were having this action inside, demanding climate justice and action on today's climate crisis.
Can you tell us why you came here from the Ecuadorian Amazon?
Because extractive industries are destroying our lands, our communities, they're violating our women, they're taking away our children's future, and I was victim of that violence as a child, and it's really painful. And indigenous peoples are the ones that are taking care of these lands and biodiversity and protecting forests, protecting water. Yet we're not being listened to. We're not being included in these conversations. And we're being lined up to march as like animals with police around us. And we should be inside there.
That was Nina Gualenga, climate activist from Sarayaku in the Ecuadorian Amazon. 350.org and a coalition of climate activists issued a statement after protesters were ejected by security here at the climate summit, saying, quote, "This has never happened before in 25 years of negotiations." After negotiating with the UN climate body organizing the summit, the UNFCCC, demonstrators eventually got their badges back and were allowed to re-enter the climate conference today. Thursday morning, activists held a news conference to address yesterday's protests. This is Jean Su with the Center for Biological Diversity.
And instead of listening to us yesterday, there was a heavy-handed crackdown upon civil society. Hundreds of us were corralled like cattle into a concrete box outside of these premises, and then were marched in cold without our jackets for hours. This is exactly what has been happening across the world. We have been shut out, and we have not been heard. We the people, have been kept out, while the very polluters who drive this crisis are kept in. We refuse to have that happen, and today we are going to allow for the people who are suffering at the front lines to speak about what they are demanding from governments.
Again, that was Jean Su with the Center for Biological Diversity. Well, we're joined right now by one of the climate activists who joined yesterday's protests, both in the afternoon, ejected by the UN and local, not clear who the security was, and who rushed the stage after Greta Thunberg spoke in solidarity with her, but addressing world leaders with their chants, shame and keep the oil in the soil. Vanessa Nakate is with us. She was Uganda's first Fridays for Future climate striker. It's great to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us. When did you get involved with the whole climate issue, Vanessa?
After my school last year, there is always a period before graduation. I wanted to do something that could cause change to the lives of the people in my community and my country. Therefore, I started carrying out research about the main problems that are faced by the people in my country, and I found a number of problems. But what struck me the most was the climate change being a problem, because it is not really taught in schools, so we don't really know that it is a challenge to us. So I decided to read more about it and understand its causes and impacts, that are making it a threat to humanity and to the lives of the people in my community. So when I realized that it was such a big threat, I found out ways to bring it to public awareness in my country, and that's how I found out about the Fridays for Future strikes, and I decided to start the climate strikes.
And what was the response in Uganda? Where did you first strike?
My first strike, I actually had 4 locations because I really wanted everyone to know about it. I think it was excitement. So I went to 4 stages. One was in Chitintale, it was a stage. Then the other was in Bugolobi. Then I also had one at a mall. It's called Village Mall. It's a big mall in Uganda.
In Kampala?
Yes, in Kampala. Then I had another one in Nakawa.
And how did people respond?
Well, people found it very weird that I was on the streets, and some of them threw some negative comments like I was wasting my time and the government will not listen to anything that I have to say, but I just kept going.
And talk about the effects of the climate crisis, specifically in Uganda.
Specifically in Uganda, we've seen the impact through torrential rainfall that has destroyed a number of things in my country. It has been raining since September up to now. Every day, it doesn't miss a chance. And each time it rains, these rains are so heavy in that they cause floods that kill people. Every time you watch news, you have to expect to see that someone died as a result of the floods. You will have to see that people's homes have been destroyed as a result of floods. You'll have to see that farms have been destroyed as a result of floods. And this is a crisis to the people in Uganda.
So you have extreme weather. You have the torrential rains every day.
Yes.
And then you have the drought.
Yes. There are areas that experience extreme drought, and this is affecting the crop production in those areas. In my country, most people depend on their farms and crops for survival, but with all these droughts and floods, people are left with no hope for the future.
You know, we're at the UN. There's a lot of UN speak, and one of them that has been around for a long time, I don't know if it's UN speak or a way to dilute the feeling. We talk about food insecurity. But when a kid is hungry, they don't say, "Ma, I feel food insecure." They say, "I'm hungry." Can you talk about how hunger relates to the climate crisis?
I will speak with the example of my country. My country heavily depends on agriculture. Therefore, most of the people depend on agriculture. So if our farms are destroyed by floods, if the farms are destroyed by droughts and crop production is less, that means that the price of food is going to go high. So it will only be the most privileged who will be able to buy food, and they are the biggest emitters in our countries. They're the ones who will be able to survive the crisis of food, whereas most of the people who live in villages and rural communities, they have trouble getting food because of the high prices, and this leads to starvation and death. Literally, in my country, a lack of rain means starvation and death for the less privileged.
Vanessa Nakate, can you talk about the climate crisis? What did the Guardian newspaper, how did they put it, a headline, why climate change is creating a new generation of child brides?
Still, I'll speak about Uganda and Africa. Most of these things happen with the rural communities because as they depend on farms, they really don't have any other hope. So if their only hope is destroyed, that means they are left in total poverty. And it's the girl child who suffers the most, because when the family has no hope for the future, that means they will have to give away their daughters for marriage at young ages, like 15 years old, 16 years old. It is really terrific to see parents give out their children. It is not because they want to, it is because it is the only way of survival. And of course, the children do not agree to this. They cry because of that. No child, no 15-year-old wants to get married to one old man, because it is these old men who get married to them. And this all points to the climate crisis. When their only hope, that is the farms and the crops that they have, is destroyed, they are only left with giving out their daughters for marriage to get something in exchange.
Can you talk about the media coverage of your climate activism?
The media is is so biased by the climate crisis. It focuses on selling news. I will have to appreciate a few media that has tried their best to try and cover the activism of people from the global south. But then there is media, especially the much bigger media. They are so biased. They want more selling news instead of selling the stories that really matter to people. They keep talking about climate change being a matter of the future, but they forget that people of the global south, it is a matter of now. And they have to help us report these things, because if they don't report these things, our leaders won't understand the importance of these strikes that we are holding.
And can you talk about the strike even yesterday, as hundreds of you gathered right here in front of the UN Climate Summit, the plenary session? You were pushed out, ejected by the UN security. Can you talk about your voices being heard inside the summit and what you demand of countries like the United States, the historically largest fossil fuel polluter?
First of all, I still can't believe that we were kicked out, because when you listen to them speak, they keep saying that they are very supportive of our actions and they are glad that we brought awareness to them about the climate crisis. But it doesn't make sense for them to say that they are supporting us and then throw us out and leave the very polluters in the building. They were left in the building. They are protecting them instead of protecting us. We are the children in this and they are the adults in this. So it was they really contradicted themselves by saying that they support our actions and then they throw us out and take away our badges.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being here. I'm glad that you got your badge back today to be on the show, being able to be inside the summit as well as outside in the streets, and as you head back to Uganda to continue your climate strike. Vanessa Nakate, climate activist, Uganda's first Fridays for Future climate striker. When we come back, we look at ground zero of the climate crisis, the Marshall Islands. Stay with us. Protesters singing during Wednesday's demonstration here at the UN Climate Summit after they were rejected from the protest site outside the plenary. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting from inside the UN Climate Change Conference here in Madrid, Spain. We turn now to ground zero of the climate crisis, the Marshall Islands, one of the lowest-lying island nations in the world, located in the central Pacific Ocean between Hawaii and the Philippines. The Marshall Islands declared a national climate crisis emergency in October. Earlier this week, Marshall Islands youth activist Carlan Zakras addressed global climate negotiators in a youth forum here at the UN summit.
Greetings from the Marshall Islands. Before I came to Madrid, exactly 2 weeks ago, I experienced 16-foot swells that forced 200 people from their homes. Not only do we have inundations, but we also have the dengue fever epidemic, the flu. And I know just recently, our Pacific neighbors in Samoa are fighting the measles that took 70 lives, 30 of which are children under the age of 4. These are illnesses linked to and made worse by climate change. We've been told that if we want to stay in our islands, we'd have to adapt and elevate. and with migration as the only plan B. We're having to deal with these issues that we in the first place did not create. And may I remind you, the Marshall Islands' contribution to climate change is only 0.00001% of the world's emissions. This is why our country is pushing for a social media campaign called Mad for Survival, and we encourage everyone to join in. My home is only 2 meters above water. With the threats of climate change, we'd lose 2 meters of our culture, our Yahweh, our Manat, our Roro, our Beat, our language, 2 meters of our legends. This is why we created a Youth Leaders Coalition that has the youth create innovative ways to fight climate change and lobby them towards our leaders. A team of students came up with a new sustainable design for a seawall that our Minister of Environment, David Paul, has shown interest towards. This is why our youth should be more involved. When you are in trouble, you find new solutions to face it. And our youth has proven to do so. This is why I'm here, to represent them and their ideas, to be a part of the generation that's going to end the fight against climate change, to voice out the reality of the future that the Marshall Islands is facing, to tell you that we don't want to lose our only 2 meters. Thank you.
That's youth activist Carlin Zachris. For more on the Marshall Islands, we're joined now by Kathy Jetnell-Kitchener, poet, climate envoy for the Marshall Islands here at the Climate Summit, also daughter of the president of the Marshall Islands. We welcome you to Democracy Now! Ground zero for the climate crisis or catastrophe. And you in the Marshall Islands have declared a climate emergency. To explain.
Yeah, so we declared a climate crisis this past September before the September Climate Summit. And this really shows that on a national level, we're recognizing how serious of an issue it is for our country, and we're trying to signal that to the international community by declaring it.
Explain how climate change affects the Marshall Islands, and how large is this archipelago of islands?
Well, it's tiny. I mean, we're a coral atoll nation, so we're one of the smallest nations on Earth. We're only 2 meters above sea level. There's no mountains. And right now...
and how many islands?
Over 60 coral atolls. Yeah, the last that I checked, but I don't have the exact number. There's quite a few. It's spread across a lot of ocean. But it's impacting us in a lot of different ways. First off, just 2 weeks ago before I came here, we had 16-foot swells of inundations that displaced over 200 people. We're having disease and health outbreaks. We had over 1,000 cases of dengue outbreaks.
How does dengue relate to the climate change?
Well, apparently the mosquito-related illnesses, mosquito-borne illnesses, increase with climate change. And so these kinds of disease outbreaks are going to increase as climate change worsens. And so these are kind of some of the impacts that we're seeing. But we're also developing our national adaptation plan, and this is we're calling it our survival plan. So we're not just looking at mitigation, lowering our CO2 emissions and, solar panels. We're looking at actually changing the entire physical landscape of our island so that we can stay above water.
Kathy, 2 years ago at the Climate Summit in Bonn, Germany, that was actually hosted by Fiji, we were joined by you and your mother, the president of the Marshall Islands, Hilda Heine. I asked her about the legacy of nuclear testing in the South Pacific and the Marshall Islands.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we'd...
The legacy of the nuclear testing program brings back the whole issue of colonialism and how the U.S. has colonized the Marshall Islands. To this day, we're still struggling with the legacy of the, what you call jellyfish babies. We have people.
This is babies without
bones that were born by women who lived in the islands that were contaminated, and we still have people who have not returned to their homelands after 50 years of being displaced from their homelands. We have islands that were vaporized by the nuclear testing program. Of course, these islands belong to people, and those can never be recovered. So we're still seeking nuclear justice for the people of the Marshall Islands. This is one of the legacy of the U.S. presence in our country, and it seems like we're repeating with the climate change issue coming on. Also, same force from outside being brought to influence or to impact the livelihood of Marshallese.
That's Marshall Islands President Hilda Heine. We're joined by her daughter, Katha Jetno-Kitchener. They were together on Democracy Now! 2 years ago in Bonn at the summit. Kathy is part of the climate delegation. She is a poet. She is a climate envoy. Because you are a poet, share a poem with us.
Yes, so this poem is actually my latest poem, and it's about that national adaptation plan I told you about. You know, as Indigenous people, we're really rooted to the land, and so having to go about these negotiations and represent our nation, it can be really disheartening. And so it's about that, but it's also about a cultural tradition called the Gemim, which is the first birthday where we celebrate our first birthday. It's the biggest one. So it's about how our cultural traditions really kind of give us hope and nourish us. And so this is the piece. I should say the Gemims is significant because children used to die at a high mortality rate. So it's a poem of survival. When my daughter whines, I tell her, say what you want in a nice voice. My nice voice is reserved for meetings with a view, my palm outstretched saying, here are our problems. Legacies rolling out like multicolored marbles. Don't focus so much on the doom and the gloom, they keep saying. We don't want to depress everyone. This is only our survival. We rely heavily on foreign aid, I'm instructed to say. I'm instructed to point out the need for funds to build islands, move families from Wedo to Wedo, my mouth a shovel to spade the concrete with, but I am just pointing out neediness. So needy, these small, underdeveloped countries. I feel myself shrinking in the back of the taxi when a diplomat compliments me. How brave for admitting it so openly. The allure of global negotiations dulls like the back of a worn spoon. I lose myself easily in a Gemim. Gemim defined as feast, as celebration. A baby's breath endures their first year, so we pack hundreds of bodies under tents lined up for plates I pass to my cousin assembly line style. Our gloved hands pluck out barbecue chicken, fried fish, scoop potato salad, do like droplets of bup and mash. Someone yells for another container of jajimi. The speaker warbles a keyboarded song. A child cries. Mine dances in the middle. The MC shouts, your children are obstructing the view. Someone wheels a grandma onto the dance floor. The dances begin. Now here is a nice celebration of survival.
Kathy Jetno-Kitchener, poet from the Marshall Islands. As we wrap up, the solutions that Marshall Islands is engaged with.
Yes. So I wanted to make it clear that, we're not just victims of this kind of process of what's happening. Marshall Islands is doing a lot in the forefront. We're one of the first countries to enhance our NDCs. We have a really ambitious 2050 renewable energy plan that we have solarized most of our outer islands. And we're leading the Climate Vulnerable Forum. We're the chair of this Alliance of 48 nations of the most vulnerable nations. We're heading the High Ambition Coalition, and we even started a Mad for Survival social media campaign while here, the Madrid Ambition Drive for Survival. And we've been going around getting as many countries as they can to join on to say that they're enhancing their NDCs.
We're going to have to leave it there, but we will continue this discussion. Kathy Jetno-Kitchener, a poet and climate envoy from the Marshall Islands, here at the UN Climate Summit. Congratulations to our news director, Mike Burke, and his wife, Michelle, on the birth of their baby boy on International Human Rights Day. Welcome to the world. And that does it for our broadcast. Thanks so much for being with us. Tell your friends. Let them know Democracy Now! Is in Madrid, Spain all week at the UN Climate Summit. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.